Hey guys, it's Matthew here once again, and my next build for you guys is the biggest throwback of them all, more or less, and that is Fakener. Fakener is a character that I made quite a few years ago, one of my first real kind of out there successful builds, which was cast on crit Cyclone into Discharge, and it has had many versions over the years, and there's been many cast on crits out there since then, but this current patch, cast on crit, has been rebuffed a bit after being nerfed many times. Discharge as well as that was nerfed many times, but there are a lot of additional tools in the game these days and a lot of additional strengths that didn't previously exist, which does bring this type of character back up to some sort of former glory. At this point, even, I'd say this character is probably stronger than what the old Fakeners were, but there's just a lot of really strong builds out there, so it's not necessarily like that above and beyond other builds that makes it too crazy. It is just simply probably one of the most practical and fun uses of Discharge in the game at the moment. So if you're looking into playing around with the Discharge spell, which straight up discharges all of your charges, endurance, power, and frenzy, then this is still an absolutely great choice to look into. The build is based around the cast on crit gem and Cyclone or Blade Flurry or whatever else you really want. Cyclone, Blade Flurry, Charge Dash, maybe even Static Strike. Those are probably your options for triggers. You attach it to the cast on crit gem and then whatever spell you want, in this case Discharge. You then have to have a pretty reliable source of generating charges so that you can constantly discharge them. Thus we have the Vol Protector chest, which gives you a huge amount of additional power charge on crit generation. You have a Vol's Devotion, which turns every single discharged power charge you have into an endurance, so you constantly top up your endurance. You have Inaya's Boots, which then give you a solid chance of getting straight up to max stacks of power charges, 25% of every single power charge generation, and all of that combined means you have some pretty ridiculous generation of charges, and with the amount that cast on crit got buffed, meaning you can discharge at least probably 5 times a second at your absolute apex, maybe even more if you keep scaling it through cooldown recovery, through attack speed, through crit chance, all of that. Currently, I'm at about 5 crits per second, and this is the result. I am an assassin. I do have 7 power charges, 4 endurance charges, and I am not using a Cospri Malice foil. Prior to this patch, cast on crit was nerfed so badly that Cospri Malice foil was the only way to really do discharge, and I am simply trying to make a version here that does not require that one item because it's pretty expensive, it's rare, and I really don't want to affect the market on that one whatsoever. So instead, at worst, I'm affecting the market on Vol's Devotions here, but Vol's Devotion isn't straight up necessary for the build unless you're going to try and push it to its absolute limits, I think. Just the active cast on crit and discharge can be done on a pretty stringent budget if you really want to do that. So currently the build has managed to get up to level 90 and it has done up to tier 15 maps, and you can take on quite a lot of the content out there reliably and safely. With the constant regeneration of your endurance charges, you are somewhat tanky, but even some of the most dangerous content, as you can see here, on a rough tier 14 map with some abyssal mods, with the betrayal, I mean, you're still going to get kind of fucked up because you are at your core a melee build still, just with a lot more flashiness. However, if you really want to take it to the absolute pinnacles of critting and cast on critting, you would probably build CI so that you can get something like 8,000 or 9,000 energy shield. You would also use a multi-modded hits can't be evaded foil. So all of that would probably end up making the build at a minimum of something like 10 exalts, whereas this one is more, at least when I put it together, it was something like 3 or 4 exalts. So at this point, gonna be a bit more, obviously, thanks to certain effects in play, but it is still supposed to be at its core somewhat of a easy to build character with just a couple of strong requirements in some slots based off of uniques. You can see that the single target isn't too bad at this point. This is a tier 13 Elder, so red and pretty high tier, and previously cast on crit discharge has never had that good of a single target. You do have to have very good gear, very good jewels. for that to work out, but currently with all the tools in the game, this against an Uber for example, we do have quite respectable damage. If you go back to my old Fakener videos and see my Uber runs then, well, it's not as impressive as this is, but the main difference being we did have Pact and Instant Leech back then, so defensively you were kind of stronger simply because you could stay topped off at 100% life basically no matter what you did. These days I have much more life, much more damage, but it does mean that you still may be a bit squishier since we don't have Pact. But the damage can be scaled to pretty respectable amounts, and the playstyle is still very fun, especially if you've never done a cast on crit discharge before. There aren't really too many opportunities to use the discharge skill out there, and as you can see, being an assassin as well, we are basically reflect immune. I can attack the mirror ad on the split phase of Uber comfortably because my discharge has something like 99% chance to crit, and every single time you crit, you do not take reflected damage. So all that means that we can run every single map mod out there, and it's working out quite a treat. So far, have not taken on Uber, just everything up till then, and hopefully in the next couple days I will have some footage of that for you as well. But for now, I do want to go over how I built the character and what it's looking like at the moment. So here's where our character currently stands, level 90 assassin called Cospri. Similar to the Fakener name, I made that one because you were trying to imitate the strongest build at the time, which was Mjolnir with Discharge. Very expensive item, very hard to get, so I instead made a cast on crit discharge with very cheap items, and it was thus called Fakener. This one, just Cospri, don't know if it's going to have the same impact, and it's just more or less a joke name, not necessarily taken seriously here. But it is the idea to not use a Cospri Malice foil, instead a pretty budget-ass, just regular foil that is crafted with a deafening essence of Zeal for the really good attack speed, and then a little bit of crit, craft a spell onto it if you can. And the idea is that you still want a foil because you do have a very good weapon range, and the crit is filled out by being assassin, so crit isn't terribly important, but you also get the multi from the foil implicit too. Now the entire thing we are building around is Discharge here, and the Vol's Protector, Vol's Devotion, Inaya's Epiphany, and also as well as that you can use the Helm Enchant to maximize your output as well. But basically Vol's Protector has always had the unique property in the game of getting a power charge for each enemy hit with a crit. Now that's not the same as power charge on crit, because power charge on crit, for example, let's say you crit 10 enemies with your one spell, you will get one power charge. You are capped by the spell to get one power charge. If you crit 10 enemies with a spell while using Vol's Protector, you get 10 power charges, or up to your maximum. So that's why Vol's Protector has always been used as the premier cast on crit discharge chest, or even just the discharge chest of choice, because you can, after every discharge, get back up to your top level of power charges if you get enough crits after that. So that's the idea there for this chest. It does really synergize super well with Discharge, though you could make the argument not strictly necessary, because if you keep generating enough charges, 25% of the time you're going to go straight up to your max with these boots anyway, but if you keep stacking this sort of shit, it should really ensure that you're popping off like pretty much your max discharges almost every time. That's why we stack this, and then this lets us have 4 endurance charges as well, and you can see that every single charge you pop off is quite large, so 4 endurance charges is also a fairly chunky addition to damage. But on top of that, having a never-ending supply of endurance charges means that you do have endurance charges for defense and a good buffer for your immortal call here, so that does make you somewhat tanky against pure physical hits. Now the reason we only do these two types of damage in the end, for lightning and fire, you have your power charge and your endurance charge, is so you can also utilize elemental equilibrium. Now back then, when I first made Cast on Crit Discharge, or Fakener, elemental equilibrium wasn't used very often, and it was pretty tough to get going in certain builds, and there wasn't as much elemental penetration out there at the time. So it was a pretty niche use, and it did go really nicely. Once again, you can still do this, but there are other things like Inquisitor and penetration gems and penetration across the tree and wise oaks that it's not strictly necessary, so you don't have to go this route, but this route is a pretty easy way of scaling your damage. So you get just a little bit of cold anywhere on your build for your Cyclone. So you can see here we have 2 to 7 cold damage, which is primarily coming from this foil. So if you get cold damage on the foil, your rings, a jewel, an amulet, which obviously can't happen with this, cold damage anywhere, that means every single time you are hitting with your Cyclone, you will be making enemies weaker to both fire and lightning. And for your discharge to go off, you have to crit with your Cyclone. So that means that every single time you're critting with Cyclone, they're weak to fire and lightning. They then just reset their elemental equilibrium every single time you're hitting the Cyclone. So you should, in theory, almost always be going off with a strong amount of negative resist to fire and lightning. And that's a really big damage boost, meaning we don't have to use as much penetration throughout the rest of our gear and tree. And other than that, we just have the Wise Oak. So for the most part, those are the base requirements for the build. A Vol's Protector, a Vol's Devotion if you really want to min-max and have the best possible discharge, and then these boots. Besides that, it's all kind of flexible. You can get, your hits cannot be evaded through a vegan craft. You can use a Gut Ripper, a Unique Claw, for example. You can just use Cospris instead, dual Cospris if you really want. You can min-max, like I said, with the vegan craft, a multi-modded version of this foil, which would be a lot more expensive, but definitely better. You can not necessarily even choose Assassin. You can do plenty of other ascendancies. You can go Energy Shield. You can go Hybrid, Low Life, whatever the shit. Your reservation necessarily doesn't have to be what mine is. There's not really too many good options, but currently I'm running Blasphemy Warlord's Mark. You could drop that altogether for the Curse on Hit Ring instead. I'm currently running Aspect of the Avian, which just gives you a bit of movement speed and a chance to do double damage on a rotating buff. Don't have to do that. You could easily go Aspect of the Spider, Aspect of the Cat. Could run Herald of Ice just for some prettier explosions. So it's pretty customizable beyond that point. It's just simply some of these uniques are going to be the staples to making Cast on Crit Discharge work. But beyond that, it's fairly customizable. This is simply my latest version and the way I've decided to try and build it. So it is an assassin, as I mentioned. When I first leveled up, the first ascendancy I got was opportunistic, just for a bit of extra movement speed, but Ambush and Assassinate will get your most reliable cast on crits started right from 38. Once you get into the Cruel Lab, I do recommend respecking and getting all of Deadly Infusion, and then grabbing whichever one out of these you want, but they do really smoothen out your playstyle and your crit. I leveled with Stormbrand up until level 38, and at level 38 you can chuck on your cast on crit setup. If you have about a 5-link Vols, you'll be doing just fine, and got a Lycosidae, any sort of foil or dagger, whatever the hell you want, and you should have enough crit from your passive tree to then start cast on critting and discharging, and that's how I leveled from 38 onwards. Now, the way, like I mentioned, for my primary 5-link, it was Discharge into Cyclone into cast on crit. That's your base. You then have increased crit strikes, just so your Cyclone has a lot of crit, and Power Charge on crit. Now, this one is primarily for the additional damage per power charges, because we have 7 charges, you get 28% more damage. If you use some other gem, let's say Controlled Destruction, we're losing a decent chunk of crit to our Cyclone, so that kind of hurts. If you're using... There's really not too many options here other than that, because we are running hybrid damage, so you don't want pure Lightning Pen, you don't want pure Fire Pen. Conk Effect and Area aren't too great early on, and they're not too necessary, so Power Charge on crit I feel is just there because it's also cheap for your Cyclone, but I think it's still a good choice. And in the end, we then attach Increased Area or Conk Effect for when we map, and you rotate them as you see fit. So the Cyclone crit is pretty important because you can see that I hit about 5 attacks a second, and currently my crit on Cyclone without power charges, nothing special, 32. Once you get completely capped on your power charges and completely capped on everything out there, you hit about a 90% effective crit rate with about, almost 6 attacks a second. That means I'm almost maximizing the amount of discharges I'm going to pop off. If, for example, we don't have that crit gem right here, I'm going to have a lot less crit, and I'm firing off, like, let's say 1 to 2 less discharges per second. So it doesn't do any damage for our discharge, as you can see, already at 91 crit. goes to 99. It hardly matters for that, but it is very important for our Cyclone crit. Now, there is a lot of information to take in there, but that's the basics. Beyond that, we're just using a cast when damage taken and mortal call for some defense. Do have a blasphemy attached to warlords and a war banner. Placing the war banner just gives us adrenaline, which is a bunch of extra damage, so that's the only reason that's in the build. I do have a vortex, an arcane surge, and a righteous fire here. So you press Vile Righteous Fire for a bunch of damage, otherwise you are running around pressing R for Vortex whenever you can, just to keep Arcane Surge up. Since it's instant, you can do it whenever you want, so that's our Arcane Surge buff. And then you pick between Whirling Blades or Shield Charge for the actual movement skill of the build. For the most part, I've been liking Whirling Blades just a bit more. It doesn't rely on my flasks being up, because Shield Charge without your flasks feels kind of slow. When you have both flasks, Shield Charge does feel a bit better. So overall, I've mostly been using Whirling Blades, but I do have Shield Charge there as well. And then finally we have Blood Rage, because occasionally I do want Frenzy Charges to go off and shatter enemies like porcupines, but otherwise not at all necessary. And then Flame Dash just to move around a bit more. The jewels for the build do have mostly crit multi, a little bit of attack speed, but crit multi is what you're looking at. And then finally, you can use an intuitive leap over here just to save 1, 2, and 3 points. So it in essence becomes just a 3-point jewel. Nothing too special, you really don't have to do this. You can instead invest those 3 points manually and then get another crit multi jewel here instead. So that's completely optional, but the important stuff here is to get all of your power charges, because every additional power charge is a buckload of extra damage, and then an additional endurance, just so that you get an additional endurance for Vol's Devotion as well. So it is going to be a bit more expensive to build at this point thanks to Vol's Devotion, but we've managed to avoid using Cospris, and so far so good. Gonna go ahead and take on some Uber Elder tomorrow, and you know what? I think it's going to do alright, and the fact that cast on crit discharge notoriously has some pretty weak single target compared to some of the other things out there, and isn't the greatest Uber Elder killer, I think I'm going to be pleasantly surprised at the fact that it really isn't as bad as it used to be, largely thanks to the cast on crit gem having a slight buff, pretty huge buff in the last patch, going down to 0.15 cooldown time. So that's the build for now, guys. Alira is the bandit. Yes, I just remembered to mention that. That's the build for now, though. Hopefully you enjoy it. Hopefully Betrayal's still going well for you. Feel free to check out some of my previous cast on crit discharges just for the history of the build, Fakener in particular. But that's it for now, guys. Hopefully I'll have a Uber Elder kill video in the next couple days. Enjoy Christmas and see you next time.